to look at finding percent of a number. Now, when you were in grade 7, you would have done the same thing, but hopefully we were forcing you to do it mentally, right? So if I needed to do something like find 10% of, let's say, the number 70, I know that 10% is 1/10 of the whole. And so what we would have done is we would have said something like, well, if 100% is that whole 70, to change 100% into 10%, I would need to divide by 10, and I would then need to do the same thing on both sides, and I would get that 10% is 7. So we can use mental math for some of this stuff, but what we're doing in grade 8 is getting a little bit more difficult with our percentage values. So I'm going to show you two different ways, and I'm mostly going to use the one way because that's the one that I like best, but either of these two ways is fine. So I'm going to do the first way that I like best. And so what I'm going to do first is if I have any percents in my fractions, I'm going to change those, if I have any fractions in my percents, I'm going to change those into decimals. So I don't want to deal with any fractions. And I'm going to change my percent to its decimal equivalent. So remember, we change something to its decimal equivalent by dividing by 100 or sliding the decimal point 2 spaces to the left. And then I'm going to change the word of to be multiply. So here I've got the word of. I'm going to change that word of into a multiplication. Okay? And then I'm going to just leave the number that's here as is and multiply. So here's what my expression would turn into. So I'm going to change 24% into its decimal. And the way I change 24% to its decimal is I either divide by 100 or I move that decimal point from being next to the 4 to 2 spaces to the left and write it as 0.24. Okay, so I'm going to take my 24% and I'm going to rewrite it as 0.24. And then I'm going to 24, not 25. Okay, and then I'm going to take that word of, which was in here, take that word of, and I'm going to rewrite that as a multiplication. So I'm going to take that word of, and I write it as a multiplication sign. And then the last thing I do is I take that number 92, although I've gone over it with my yellow, so I apologize for that. I'm going to take that 92 and just leave it as 92. And that's what I'm going to type into my calculator. So I'm going to go 0.24 times 92, and when you type that in, it gives you 22.08. Okay? Now, there is another way to do it, okay? What you could do if you like, so same thing, I got to get rid of any fraction percents, right? So if I've got like 1/2%, and we'll see that in the next one, I got to get rid of that and change it to a decimal. Okay, I'm still going to then change of into being a multiplication, and I'm just going to multiply both numbers, but in this step, because I didn't change the percent into a decimal, I have to divide my final answer by 100. And so I'm still dividing by 100 like I did here, but I'm just going to do it later on in my work. So I'm just going to take the 24, multiply by the 92, and then afterwards I'm going to divide by 100. Okay, and so same thing, type 24 times 92 into your calculator and then divide by 100. You'll still get the 22.08. Both will work. I don't care which method you like best, but I'm going to be using this one for most of my computations. Okay, so here we go. Now I've got a fraction in my percent. Okay, so I'm going to pull this down here a little bit. I didn't realize it was going to get blocked on my tablet. So the first thing I need to do is change any fraction percents to decimal. So this says find 1/2%. That's no good. I don't want that. I need to rewrite 1/2% as its decimal equivalent. So remember, 1/2%. This means I don't even have 1 full percent. If I was to draw this on the grid, I would have to zoom into a square and I would only be coloring in half of it, right? So I'd zoom into a square and I would split it in half and I would only color in one piece of that little square. So this is not the same thing as 50%. I need to change my 1/2 into 1 divided by 2, and that gives me 0.24. 0.5, and I have not yet divided by 100 anywhere, so my percent sign stays at the end of my number. I have not divided by 100, so I still have this as a percent. So right now I have 0.5% of 150. Now I can go through the rest of my steps. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my percent 0.5%, I'm going to change that into its decimal. So taking 0.5 and I divide by 100, that gives me 0.005. And I'm going to take that word of, and I'm going to change it to a multiplication symbol, and then I'm going to keep my 150 as 150. So this is 0.005 multiplied by 150, and if you type that into your calculator, it's going to give you 0.75. Okay? Let's look at another one. Now I've got 94 1/4 of a percent of the number 32. Okay? And so with this one, I'm going to change the 95 1/4. I'm going to take 95 1/4%. I'm going to rewrite that as 95.25%. And I get that because 1 divided by 4 is going to give me 0.25, but it's not 0.25 because I have the 95 in front. So it's 95.25. Okay? All right, so now I have 95.25%. That percent sign is still there, of 32. Remember, I have to keep that percent sign until I've divided by 100. So I'm going to take my 95.25% and I'm going to divide by 100. And that gives me 0.9525. Then I'm going to take my of and change it into a multiplication, because of in math means multiply. And then we're going to leave the 32 as 32. And so we have 0.9525 times 32. When you multiply that together in your calculator, it gives you 30.48. Okay? Now, we also have percents that are bigger than 100, and we're going to use the exact same process if our percent is bigger than 100. Okay, so 145% of 80. I'm going to start by taking that 145%, no fraction attached to it this time, so it's a little bit easier. I'm going to divide that by 100 to turn it into its decimal, and its decimal form is 1.45. Then I'm going to get rid of that of, and I'm going to change it into a multiplication symbol, because of in math means multiply, and I'm going to keep the 80 as an 80. 1.45 times 80 ends up giving us 116. Okay? Last one. Something bigger than 100 and has a fractional portion onto it. Okay, so if I was to change the 230 7/8 of a percent into its decimal, I'm going to have 230, and then I'm going to look at the 7/8. So the way I get 7/8 is I'm going to take 7 divided by 8, and that equals 0.875. But it's not 0.875, it's 230.075. So the 875. So there's my percentage. Okay, now I haven't divided by 100, so I have to keep the percent sign there. 230.875% of 40. And now I'm going to take my percent and I'm going to change it into my decimal form, which is 2.30875. I'm going to take of and write it as a multiplication. And then we're going to take the 40 and leave it as a 40. And we simply type this into our calculator, 2.30875 times 40, and that's going to give us 92.35. Now we're going to be using percent of a number quite a lot. Whenever we look at finding the cost of an item, we have to add on things like GST, PST, taxes. If we're looking at finding discounts or sale prices, all of our work is going to involve finding percent of a number. Okay, so very simply, change any fraction percent inside of the percent to its decimal. So that was what we did here. We didn't want 7/8 of a percent, so we changed that 7/8 to be rewritten as 0.875. If you already have a decimal in your percent, you can just leave it as is. Once we've changed it so that we have no fraction and our percent is written as a decimal, we simply change it into a decimal number with no percent sign at the end, which means we've divided by 100, change of to times, and the number stays as is, and you simply multiply in your calculator to get the answer. Okay, that's finding percent of a number.